Jungle is probably the hardest role in the game to play at an entry level, with most players not even understanding themselves how to path optimally for their champion, let alone when to gank or when to farm. So if most jungle mains out there don't even understand what they're doing, how can we possibly expect a laner to understand the role? Well, that's what we'll be covering today. We'll be breaking down the ins and outs of the jungling early game, as well as giving you all the most important timers that you need to know, so you can start spotting these ganks coming from a mile away. My name's Rogue and I played League of Legends professionally for 7 years. Now I'm a full-time content creator and coach for all ranks Iron through to Challenger. So if you want more information of what a coaching session with me will look like, you can find more information by following the link in the video description below. And while you're down there, you'll also find the link to Ghost Academy, where I'll be running classes every 2 weeks, and with my discount code Rogue, you'll even find the first month free, so you can easily drop in and check it out. Before we look at timers or pathing, we first have to get on the same page about the different styles of jungler that exist, which can all be broken down in a rather simple way. First, we draw a line, in which we're going to place all of our jungler champions on. On the far left extreme, we have supporting champions like Nunu and Ivern, which we can basically refer to as ganking junglers. These champions have a ton of crowd control, which defines their role in 2 ways. Their crowd control makes them very good gankers in early levels, but it also makes them not too dependent on gold and XP, since a knockup is a knockup and a stun is a stun, regardless of how much gold or XP you have. On the other extreme, we have farming junglers. These are champions with little to no crowd control like Master Yi, or champions that are completely dependent on their ultimate like Nocturne. And again, this is their defining characteristic. This lack of crowd control makes their early ganks terrible when compared to other junglers, and their dependence on gold and XP means that deviating away from their farm has the risk of putting them massively behind if they don't get a kill from the gank, in which case they would just become useless. Then, in the middle, we have champions that are the in-between of these 2 styles. Champions like Volibear and Jarvan, who bring with them potentially strong early ganks, like the ganking junglers, but is still somewhat dependent on gold and XP like the farming jungler. But not quite to the extreme of either side. These champions have some utility in their kit so can afford to fall a little bit behind, but they can't spend all of their time spam ganking because they're at least somewhat dependent on gold and XP. Now that we understand how the line works, we can fill in the spaces in between. Just ask yourself, how strong are the early ganks? How dependent on gold is the champion? And with just those 2 questions, you can probably place a champion on this line yourself pretty accurately. Now that we can see a jungler's archetype and accurately determine how much they can gank versus how much they need to farm, how do we actually utilize this information? Well, in order to answer that question, we have to learn the basics of jungle pathing. So to start with, the most basic clear a jungler can do is of course a full clear. We start on one side of the map, doing all of our camps in sequence onto the other side, and at the end, we recall. Now coming out of base, our camp respawn looks something like this. Camp 1, Camp 2, Camp 3, and Camp 4. Which means that we only have one option where to go, back to where we started, farming in yet again the same direction. And this is what I like to refer to as the script. The script idea basically points you in a direction of your camp respawn, and if you want to farm optimally, you have to follow very strictly this script idea, doing ganks that align with it. We can do mid ganks on the way through. We can do bot ganks at the end of our script, before we recall, and we can do top ganks after we do a full clear, recall, and at the beginning of our next script. This leaves us always farming in the optimal direction, following that script idea. Now let's imagine we did something a little bit different, and we went against the script idea. So we started on our top side, did 3 camps, and instead of going into bot side jungle, where our script is following us pointing towards our farm, we did something like double back into top lane. Now this brings with it a lot of consequences. To start, there's going to be no way for us to farm our camps in a nice clean sequence now because the respawns are staggered. Again, we're also going the opposite direction of our jungle camps, walking all the way into top, spending time on a gank, and then having to traverse the entire map to get back to our bot jungle, which is our third problem. It leaves our bot jungle open to being counter jungled, which can be a massive problem putting us behind. And now to bring this all together, we have to bring up the idea from the start of the video with the different jungle types on the line. Imagine you're playing a farming jungler, like Master Yi, and you do your 3 camps topside and then gank top. First of all, the gank isn't very likely to work. You don't have any crowd control, so it's a pretty big risk. And the risk is massive here because you're delaying your farm, and in a worst case scenario, you lose your entire bot side, which is not something that a farming jungler can afford to do. They have to follow that script very, very strictly. Now, if you're playing a champion like Nunu, on the other hand, it's not as punishing. 3 camps into top is very likely to work as a gank because you already have 2 forms of crowd control, and you're a very strong ganker. And the risk of losing your bot side jungle really doesn't hit as hard. You're basically a support champion, and the risk of losing the bot side might be worth the potential reward that you get for your top laner. By placing a jungle champion onto this line, you can basically create an idea of how they should path and how predictable they're going to be. Whilst a ganking jungler close to the far left is going to be hard to predict, you can generally expect them to do very early ganks after either 1 or 3 camps. Whilst on the other hand, a farming jungler from the far right is going to be really predictable. They're forced to full clear, and they follow their camp respawn in a really predictable and easy to read way, whilst the champion in the middle has a little bit of wiggle room either way. They most likely still want to make something happen early, but they're going to do it in a way that isn't going to impact their farm too much. A path that I really like doing, and that you can come to expect of junglers from the center of that line like Jarvan and Volibear, would look something like this. You do your full bot side jungle into a gank, either mid or top lane. Now this has the benefit of hitting with an extremely early gank like a ganking jungler, without the major drawback of losing half of your jungle to a major script break, since at the end of your gank you can simply come back to your top jungle and finish off the 3 camps there. Again, this is falling somewhere in between the extremes of a ganking jungler and a farming jungler, which is exactly what your archetype is. It's that in between. Now that we fully understand the different style of junglers and the paths that they're likely to do, we can start to predict when it's possible for them to gank. There are 3 major timers that a gank is likely to hit in a jungler's first clear, and they all coincide with the jungler's level ups. Firstly, we have the 1 camp gank, which will hit as soon as you get to lane. Extremely cheesy, by far the most uncommon one, and you should only expect this from the most selfless ganking junglers, since it will put them insanely behind camps. Next we have the 3 camp gank. 3 camps will give a jungler level 3, and the gank will hit at around the time of 2:30 in game. This is a great timer to know if you're a mid laner, since it's about the timer that a jungler will cross from one side of the map to the other, meaning you should consider hugging the opposite side of the lane from then on. Then we have the 6 camp gank, by far the most predictable and easiest to avoid. This will hit around 3 minutes 30, or on your 4th minion wave, and it's about the only timer that a farming jungler can gank you without risking their farm in some way. Finally, the timer of a jungler's first camp respawn, which is an easy one to remember because it's the weak number, 420. From this timer onwards, a jungler will arrive back on the side of the map that they started, meaning if your lane opponent leash level 1, this is when their jungler will be back to gank you. So now we can put everything we've learnt all together in order to track the enemy jungler and show you just how every lane should play with this information. So to start with, Kha'Zix, that's a farming jungler. No CC in his kit, very gold dependent, and needs level 6, so we can pseudo rule out those early ganks as they're pretty unlikely for him to do. The enemy sees that our top laner leashed, so we already know that Kha'Zix can only gank top until 2 minutes 30, but again we can sort of rule that out because it's unlikely, he's so gold dependent. Mid laner should know that he needs to hug bot side because he knows our jungler started top until this 2 minute 30 timer. Now that we get to 2 minute 30, our jungler crosses mid and LeBlanc should start hugging bot side. And now it's in the realm of possibility that Kha'Zix could be bot lane. If he was playing something like Volibear or Jarvan, this would be a great gank timer, but because he's a farming jungler, still, we don't have to really respect him too much. He's probably not ganking until after 6 camps, which brings us till this moment. Kha'Zix finishes his last camp, and we're at 3 minutes 30. Now is the time where he has to gank. There's nothing for him to do. He takes his crab, and just after that timer, voila, just on time, Kha'Zix goes for his first gank of the game on mid lane. But luckily LeBlanc knows exactly where to stand in the lane. He knows Kha'Zix can only be on top side at this moment, and doesn't have to start thinking about Kha'Zix being on top side until that 420 timer when his first camp respawns. We jump forward to just after that 420 timer, and Kha'Zix is arriving at 430 to do his first camp right on spawn. So Aurelia knows this is the timer for him to be top. LeBlanc knows that he has to hug bot side, and bot lane knows they're in the clear against his ganks. I'll display on screen now all of those timers I mentioned earlier, although keep in mind, while these are the optimal timers for a jungler to gank, and whilst the jungler's champion does somewhat limit when they are capable of ganking, the lower elo the game is, the more variance there will be. A low elo jungler can path suboptimally and gank at a strange time catching you off guard, but that gank will be far less likely to work, and far more punishing if it doesn't succeed. But still, if you're playing in bronze, sometimes the enemy Master Yi will one camp gank you. But if it doesn't work, he will fall massively behind. And even if it does work, it probably wasn't worth it for him anyway. With how long it took to get the kill, he's so far behind your jungler in camps. If you want to learn more about optimal jungle pathing, check out my previous video, which will be linked in the video description. And if you want to support me, the best thing you can do is leave a like, a comment, or subscribe to help out the YouTube algorithm. Thanks for watching.